Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you here today for our event. My name is Julia Anderson. I am CanWaCH's Chief Executive Officer. And today we're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the report on the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. It's the holiday season. I've been thinking a lot about home. I was raised in Northern Alberta. I'd like to acknowledge the homeland of the many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked that land since the time immemorial. Profoundly grateful for the lessons that I've taken from the Indigenous leaders and elders that I've had the great pleasure of learning from. And I hope that my words today will do honor to the people of the Treaty 8 territory and to all the Indigenous nations from coast to coast to coast on this land. I am so very excited about the incredible, inspiring women we have joining us today. We organize a lot of events at CanWaCH. We used to do a lot of in-person events back when that was a thing, pre-2020. This year, we've done many, many virtual events. And I must say that this event has been special, and it's been special because there has been so much joy brought from the team at the Minister's Office, from the Department of Women and Gender Equality, and from my colleagues here at CanWaCH. We are so excited about today's program. And that's because there is a celebratory note. We're celebrating an anniversary of an important milestone in the history of women's rights in Canada. It's important to recall that just getting to the point where the report was released was not without adversity. Laura Saby, who was then president of the Association of Canadian University Women, had to threaten that she would bring over 2 million women to march in protest on Parliament Hill if they did not establish the Royal Commission that day in 1966. And the struggle to advance women's rights was far from over and is far from over. Even 4 years later, when the report was released, the job had not been done, nor is it done today. So while we celebrate the 50 years of progress, we will share share important milestones with you. We must also pay homage to those who have fought the good fight for us. And we must recognize that we still have so far to go for women and people all across the gender spectrum here in Canada. Later in our panel discussion with the Minister for Women and Gender Equality, the Honourable Mariam Monsef, we'll hear from young leaders. These are the people leading the movement today, and they are the leaders that will carry the torch forward from us. The first motivating woman that we'll hear from, however, is Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the Honourable Chrystia Freeland. I am a big fan of Ms. Freeland's work, and it is such an exciting moment to bring her today to a CanWaCH event. She is the first woman to hold the role of Canada's Finance Minister. Ms. Freeland has also been the Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and International Trade, all portfolios of importance, all portfolios where leadership is necessary. She was elected as a Member of Parliament in 2013 and has served since then. We are so grateful today that the Deputy Prime Minister has agreed to share some words with us, marking this milestone and talking about ways forward. I turn it over to the video.
Cette année marque le 50e anniversaire du rapport de la Commission royale d'enquête sur la situation de la femme. This report brought to light widespread discrimination against women in Canada and set out a path to address it. While there has been progress, of course, in the last 50 years on gender equality in Canada, we still have a lot of work to do. Cela est particulièrement vrai dans notre contexte actuel. La pandémie a révélé et amplifié de nombreuses inégalités qui existent au Canada. The nature of this health and economic crisis is that it hits women the hardest, particularly low-income, Indigenous women, racialized women, LGBTQ2 individuals, and women with disabilities. This crisis is a she-cession, as women have largely borne the brunt of job losses, holding a larger share of low-wage and frontline jobs, and women still shoulder the vast burden of unpaid care at home. This is a critical time for women. We must not let the pandemic destroy the progress we've made. Nous ne devons pas permettre à la pandémie de détruire le progrès que nous avons réalisé. And we won't.
Our sincere thanks to Minister Freeland for sharing her reflections on the 50th anniversary of the report on the Royal Commission of the Status of Women. We're very much looking forward to working with Minister Freeland and the Government of Canada as we launch our Equal Futures Network, which is a CanWaCH project bringing together organizations, agencies, businesses, and individuals, projects that are all committed to one goal, and that is advancing gender equality from coast to coast to coast. And now it's our great privilege that we'll hear from some more amazing Canadian trailblazers and women. Our idea for this event was that we'd have a little bit of a time capsule, a way to capture that generation after generation, progress has been made. However, that is only because of the hard work that was invested by individuals. And it is such an honor these distinguished Canadians took time to record their reflections to be put into our time capsule on the past 50 years and the current state of women's rights in Canada and around the world. In recognizing these amazing women, we must also remember the many unrecognized women that created the enabling environments for these women to succeed. These are the much talked about at this time, healthcare workers, frontline workers, the people who pepper our day-to-day and often go unrecognized in these big events and moments. I hope that everything we talk about today holds up all women, regardless of the role that they played, regardless of the moment that they came into this story. These women that we have and are recognizing today are from diverse backgrounds, different generations, and have lived and are living through varied experiences. They have one special thing in common though, the ability to see and imagine a different future just beyond the horizon. To imagine what it could look like if things were just that much better, and then to put in the work and the day-to-day grind that it takes to get there. In this amazing book that was recently released called Commanding Hope, The Power We Had to Renew a World in Peril, the author, Homer Dixon, speaks about special individuals and leaders who play this role of helping us imagine what's next and what we can't quite see just beyond the horizon. And in listening to the stories today, I think I heard that in all of these women, a vision, but also an ability to dig in, get their hands dirty, and do the work. And I hope that I have the courage and the vision to do the same. I'm in awe of these 11 women who have each moved mountains to advance gender equality. They're Canadian icons, and I'm just so grateful that they've agreed to gift us and you with the time to record the reflections. So dear guests, please join me in welcoming, however you do that in your home space, a little dance, a little clap, or a deep breath to take in the inspiration that's about to come. And we'll watch the perspectives and the reflections of these trailblazing women who have overcome so many roadblocks, influenced policy, and fought for the empowerment of all women and humans across this country. Over to the video.
In 1942, I was working for the Canadian subsidiary of a large American engineering company, M.W. Kellogg. I was transferred to Toronto to set up the office to build the world's first synthetic rubber plant at Sarnia, Ontario. I became, of course, the office manager of that company. That's back to 1942. Then in 1947, I worked for them till 1951. in 1947, I met Charlotte Whitten, the mayor of Ottawa, one of the first female mayors of Canada. She was an unusual individual. I was president of the Anglican Young People's Association of Canada at the time, the first female president. Charlotte Whitten was a Roman Catholic converted to the Anglican Church. And would you believe that she was appointed to the Synod of the Anglican Church, which I got to tell you, for a woman to go into that hot stove league of the Anglican Church was quite an accomplishment. So Charlotte Whitten had a major impact on my life because I saw a woman way back then could become mayor of a city, the capital of Canada, and could be a member of the Anglican Synod of Canada, which would be almost impossible for a woman to become a member. So that was the beginning. As the first female president of the Anglican Young People's Association, I toured Canada. I was the first female president of the Anglican Young People's Association in 1947. So it goes way back to then. Then in 1967, I ran as deputy reeve of Streetsville, all male council. And the women did not support me. They thought they didn't know where this wild woman came from that wanted to get into a man's world, politics. I was defeated the first year I ran, but the second year I ran, I won. In 1968, became the first mayor of the town of Streetsville in 1970, and became the first mayor of the town of Mississauga in 1978. And retired as mayor of Mississauga in 2014. Whatever they undertake to do, a woman has to become confident in herself. And when you have confidence in yourself, it convinces others to have confidence in you. And I think women have to portray as strong. They have strength. They not only have great knowledge, great understanding, intuition, second to none, but they got to prove that they can do anything a man can do. If you're prepared to listen and to seek advice and to connect yourself with people that can be of assistance to you, to help you attain your desire to be a success, that's what really works.
I remember when that report came out, and that it was really a big deal that the government was doing something to really focus on the issues of women. And yet there was also that feeling that, oh, it's a report, and what are all of these men going to do with this report? So at the time in 1970, I was actually a women's page reporter in a small newspaper. So I had the fun of writing about the Royal Commission's report, which was, I was encouraged. Since then, a few years later, I got involved in the development of the first women's shelter in Canada. So that to me was, when I look back at it, to see it started in 1973. All those years later, there's over 600 shelters across Canada. Canadians know that violence against women is wrong. Unfortunately, they also know that it's everywhere. But really, there's been an incredible network of social supports and social services and awareness and feminist sort of recognition that women deserve better. And we certainly haven't found all the answers. So women are much more likely to find support and to be helped, but they're just as likely and maybe even more likely to experience violence. So that's the downside. Next for this work is for us to arrive at the place where we're celebrating that women no longer experience violence. And this is a place we can't get to without men being involved. Men are the ones who have to stop being violent. And yet they too are embedded in a culture which is incredibly violent, which has a violent history. And it's colonialist, it's misogynist, it's racist. And men and women have to find a way out of this together. But really, it's not going to work if it's women just trying to change men and their behavior. I think one of the most amazing things is the Me Too movement. Back in those early days of the shelter movement, we could never have imagined even having a mechanism for women to reach out and connect with each other that way, directly and without any kind of intervention of a service being needed or an agency. It was a woman-to-woman exercise of declaring their experience and looking to support from each other. And I think it's been phenomenal. I think the work that I've been doing with all of these other women is all about hope. And you can't do it if you don't bring hope to it. And hope is what makes us and helps us all carry on. And hope is what women who are suffering, what drives them to. So anything that we can do to keep that hope alive, but keep it alive with real change and real progress. And I can see that happening all around us. So I still feel hopeful.
I thought a lot about what kind of changes there have been. At my age, of course, been quite a few, but just to name a few, I think that have been particularly important for women. I think there are more women running for politics. There are more women entrepreneurs. The availability of daycare, still not universal, but has certainly made a big difference for women. Equal pay for work of equal value. And also things like more choice, pro-choice, options for people, contraception, availability. And one I was thinking about is the fact that we've gone from paternity leave to parental leave. And I think that's a big acknowledgement of shared responsibility of family. It's taken in different ways and so on, but it is there. So I think that's an important advance that we've had, or that's some of them. And there are many others, but in my view, in the short time, those would be the main ones. When I was asked, I believe, on what has impacted my life, and I got into politics because I was a social worker in Toronto and working in low-income communities. And what really struck me is that so many of the issues we were dealing with, and individuals were dealing with, more importantly, were structural and cultural more often than just individual. And I began to think about that, and that led me to becoming involved in politics, not at that time as an elected member, but being involved in a political party. I've been inspired by many women and men. And I think as individuals, certainly my mother was involved in local politics. Individuals like Pauline Jewett and Rosemary Brown and Marion Dewar were great inspiration to me. But perhaps the greatest inspiration was those women that I came to know who were able to very bravely overcome the limitations of their circumstance. And by that, I mean that perhaps they were low income, perhaps they had many social issues, but despite that, they were really able to make a change for themselves, but also for their community. And I found that incredibly inspiring. I hope we've gone by the days when women would not identify as feminists. Certainly In earlier days, many women did not, even though I might have said that they were feminists, because to me, it simply means that we're working for equality. And that includes all kinds of equality. So I think we might have gone beyond that a little bit, because I think many younger people don't recognize the changes that came about because of the advocacy of women and some men. And I think we can't forget that there have been men who have supported the advancement of women, not just legislatively, but in other ways as well. And I think that's important to acknowledge. As for the road ahead, I think the most ubiquitous concern is violence against women. And not just physical violence, but cultural violence. Violence in the workplace, whether it's harassment, or I would even consider lack of advancement for women as a form of violence in our culture. And to be honest, I don't think that's changed an awful lot. As we know, the pandemic has highlighted the inequalities for many women in the workplace. Racial inequality remains, gender inequality. So we have a long way to go, I believe, to see those changes in our culture generally. And I think to do this, we have to work with men. And we have to ensure that we work with those men who share our ideals and make that kind of progress that we can. If I could urge women to do one thing, it would be to be brave. And that's hard. You know, no real change, in my view, has ever been made by just playing by the rules. Wish I could say it did, but I haven't observed that in my lifetime. Someone once talked about the art of being fearless. It's tough. It's hard to go outside the norm. It's hard to be an advocate when not everyone agrees. And you have to learn that not everyone will agree. But the benefits are what has made real change. And I've had the opportunity to do a lot of international work since I left elected politics. And the women I'm inspired by everywhere, including here in Canada, are those women who were able to stand up against great odds, far greater than here, and make a real change and a difference, sometimes to the detriment of their life. They were very brave. So that would be my encouragement for women for 2021. I think we're just going to forget 2020, but 2021, let's just step out and really make a difference. And I think we can do that and build on the benefits that many of us have enjoyed. Someone once said to me, I'm not sure that I believe it, but they said it. They said, you know, you took the stairs so we could take the elevator. And I just want to acknowledge all of those women who helped me on the stairs and all those women who can now take the elevator. Congratulations on the 50th anniversary.
Sego, bonjour, greetings everyone. I am so honored to help commemorate the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. You know, its recommendations brought about significant changes for many young women, but not all. And we need to do more than honor women like Florence Bird, Jeannie Lapointe, and Doris Anderson, who more than anyone else was responsible for the creation of the Royal Commission. It's not that they don't deserve it. It's because if they were here today, they would say, okay, what's next? Well, a lot has changed in 50 years, but ironically, the changes have revealed how much more needs to be done. Reproductive rights are pretty solidly entrenched, but legal barriers still exist for those of us who are Indigenous, racialized, or differently abled. And cultural barriers, women feel them every day. Women continue to suffer disproportionately from economic inequality, something that has been thrown into sharp relief with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is differential access to health care for women, and while they are doing much better in education, there's much room for improvement. Well, ending this economic inequality will require some heavy lifting. If we are to end the remaining structural inequality, we're going to need new structures. Yes, I said new structures. We can't keep on doing the same thing in women's education and health and expect different results. This is especially true when it comes to Indigenous women, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I honor today the legacy of the Royal Commission that has at its core a vision of women fully participating in society and deciding how that should be accomplished. When I look back at what has been done, I'm excited about what the next generations can do. Nyawagoa, thank you for listening to my words.
Hello, I'm Marion Buller. I'm a member of the Mistawasses First Nation in Saskatchewan, but I'm coming to you today from the ancestral, unceded, and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people, also known as Vancouver, BC to a lot of people. I was a judge here in Vancouver for 22 years, and then I went on to be the Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I was a 17-year-old at the time that the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women was issued. And I think back on that time, the work was very controversial. It started some very difficult conversations, and there was a lot of criticism about the report and the commissioners for that matter. But the Royal Commission and the report really both were important starting points for change and having a blueprint to move forward with for equality. Gender equality, as we call it now. I can tell you, looking back on all of those years, there have been a lot of changes, but there's still a lot of changes that have to be made. A lot of the recommendations from the report were not implemented even now. So I think it's important to note with particular significance that the report and the Royal Commission's work, for that matter, really focused on mainstream white urban women, and only parenthetically referred to immigrant women, and even more parenthetically referred to Indigenous women. And I think if we've learned anything in the last 50 years, and especially from the work of the National Inquiry, we know that we have to start working on ensuring gender equality for Indigenous women, Black women, and women of color. So now, what to do over the next 50 years? It's important to know that the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls set out 231 calls for justice. These aren't mere recommendations, they're legal imperatives based on all of the human and Indigenous rights breaches that we heard in the course of the National Inquiry. The final report, the 231 calls for justice, set out a blueprint for moving forward that has to be done.
The hard work of the women's suffrage movement in Canada in the early 1900s ensured that women could run for public office and vote. Also, thanks to the famous Five and the groundbreaking Persons Case of 1929, women are indeed recognized as persons. My mother was born in Canada 6 months before women could vote in Ontario. With my father, she was determined that their 2 little girls did not succumb to negative forces that could preclude them from achieving their dreams. This especially included the right of education and equality of opportunity.
that they fought so hard in their own lives, my mother achieving her Bachelor of Arts degree as an adult, and faced down individuals and institutions that threatened their children's participation because they were girls, I will not let them down. The test of being the first Canadian female astronaut did not stop with my successful spaceflight, on which I was the only female crew member. It persisted when I was not granted an opportunity to train further with NASA, as was given the men who were selected with me in the first cohort of Canadian astronauts. No explanation was ever given past, "Your contract is over." There were no mechanisms for appeal and no reachable network of women to advise me. All of my life, I have conducted myself as a person, and that is what I ask of others, that gender and race do not cloud judgment, diminish respect, or dismiss opportunity. We have come far, yet there is much to be done. Although technology shrinks the oceans that separate us, misinformed rhetoric and malformed opinion threaten us with a tsunami of mistrust, denigration, and even emotional and physical harm. Where there is poverty, hunger, and lack of education, marginalized women and girls are especially vulnerable. Today, I am using my platform at Having Seen the Earth from Afar to connect people to the natural world through the educational and research programs of the foundation that bears my name. A human being of any size or shape is a frail life form compared to a virus that we cannot see. When we are not inclusive of each other, we harm ourselves in solving the great issues that we face, such as accessing space and protecting against pandemics. We need all of us, not just to survive, but to thrive in a just society grounded in ethics.
What we're finally seeing for women and girls with disabilities and deaf women and girls is a strong allyship in the feminist movement. You know, that's taken some time. It's an increased understanding of intersectional feminist analysis is beginning to change that, but it's very slow incremental work. And I think, you know, like I said, there's a lot more work to do because we need to see Black, Indigenous, and women with disabilities centered in the rights movement, feminist movement. When I think about what's next for the feminist movement, I guess I'd say I'm an optimist and I'm really beginning to see change. I believe we're moving in the right direction now with increased awareness about systemic discrimination, especially about more recently systemic discrimination and its impacts on Indigenous and Black women. You know, the convergence of the social movement is something that I think is exciting and holds promise for all of us. And that social justice movement is eventually going to center disability because it's the one intersection in our movement that needs to be centered for us to be a fully inclusive movement. Human rights are not something we can take for granted in Canada. And the notion that we are where we need to be is something we need to let go of. We're an aspiring nation. We have huge potential, and we have an incredible human rights movement in this country, but one that needs to be brought together, one that needs to be centered with all of us in the same space, sharing the same objective, which is, like I said, to be the kind of Canada that everybody's included in. Thank you.
It's important to know the past, to know the history. And I think the fact that that I placed on as a motion in the House of Commons in 1995, that we recognize February as Black History Month in Canada. It was because I wanted us to look at the history of African Canadians, to know how long we've been here from 1603, to know the people who have been making contributions to Canadian society, recognized and unrecognized, to know each other in Canadian society. And so I am always pushing for that knowledge base, because that's the only way we could go forward when we have the knowledge. It's very important that there was a time we used to have what was called investigative reporters who would dig and find the facts and find the whatever and present it. and we would all read it in various formats. But nowadays, it's all social media. Anyone can write any damn nonsense and put it out there and find that someone would be believing, because we somehow or the other have gotten away from the research, from reading, from going back like the Sankofa to say, what was back there that we need to bring to the present so that we can plan to the future. And my final message to young people around the 50 years since we made those 167 recommendations, the Commission on the Status of Women, the Byrd Commission, Florence Byrd, who headed the commission. We need to read and see and understand where we were then, where we are now, and how important it is for us to go forward.
To everyone involved in the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, thank you for your involvement, and thank you for marking this 50th anniversary of the release of the report of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in Canada. It was an important milestone. I was a young girl at the time that the report was released, and I remember how significant it was that there was a document that had been put together and that was pointing to how we could level the playing field for women and the changes that needed to happen, whether it was in pay equity or childcare or women's health, all of the areas where women were dealing with serious inequity. The challenge is that today there are still those inequities, some of them. We have come a long way, and as the first female Premier of Ontario, I can tell you that I'm well aware of how we have worked for the last 50 years to change the status of women, to change the opportunities for women and girls in this country. And there are more opportunities. There's more of an expectation that we will take our place, that we will not assume that we are going to be at home looking after children only with our husbands, because that was the assumption when I was growing up. So I want to just say that I feel privileged to live in this country, to live in a place where we have elected leaders who are committed to the ideal of improving the playing field for women and men. And I also want to acknowledge that there are different expectations and different possibilities for women from different backgrounds. And so we have to acknowledge that there are still issues of race and of socioeconomic status that change the equation for women. And so we still have a lot of work to do so that all women and girls in this country feel that they have the opportunity to be who they want to be. And I want to just again thank you all for being committed to this and for continuing the work that was begun so many years ago.
For me, Michelle Obama would be one of my biggest role models because she was able to use her position of power and the success she's had to really advocate for all girls to receive an education so that they would be able to break the cycle of poverty and break the cycle of abuse and be able to go and lead the lives that they wanted. In terms of what I think is next for the movement, I would love to see more underrepresented populations be represented in government, be represented in the STEM fields, be represented in positions of power. And in terms of me personally, what I hope to do is continuously advocate and look for ways to support other underrepresented populations of women, such as women who are incarcerated or women who are pregnant and homeless. In terms of gender equality, I hope that in the future, all individuals who identify as women or non-binary individuals receive equal opportunity and chances that men receive in society.
That was an inspiring, truly inspiring video reel of women who have paved the way, women who have acted with bravery, with confidence, as Hazel McCallum said, demonstrating what can be done beyond the margins. A few of the quotes that I loved: "Be brave, don't play by the rules." I encourage everyone to go to the equalfutures.ca and hashtag your favorite quote out of those inspiring women's stories. I loved the idea of the parenthetic reference. So how can we drop the parenthesis? How can we drop the side note around Indigenous women, women of color, women from racialized communities? How can we bring them up to be the main story, not the side note story from Marion Buller? Your contract is over from Roberta Bondar with no explanation. The call for pay equity, for equality in the workplace, so powerful from this woman who has literally been to space. The idea of an aspiring nation and not accepting the fact that we are there, and in fact, revolting against the notion that we are there until everybody is there. From Bonnie, we are an aspiring nation that has far to go. Dig deep into the research and learning and drop the any damn nonsense you hear on social media is correct. Research, educate yourself, and understand. And Lynn, one of the early interveners, telling us that we will not be there until there is no longer violence against women. An idea that at this point in the pandemic 2020 feels so beyond the margins of possibility, as we've seen acts of violence against women rise, not reduce. And I think many of our speakers spoke to that. So many concepts and ideas and inspiring thoughts to take us forward. We're going to move fairly quickly to a break, and then we'll commence with the next portion of our programming, where we'll focus on some young speakers who are going to talk about the next 50 years. What are the stories that we'll be telling in the time capsule 50 years from now? And this panel will be hosted by the Honorable Maryam Monsef. And I hope that you'll find it as inspiring as those, and more inspiring than those speakers that we just heard. Please do join the conversation on social media and engage with the Equal Futures Network, as well as CanWaCH. We'd love to hear your reflections after hearing the stories that we're sharing today, your reflections on where we're at with those 160 plus recommendations and where we need to go. After all, this is a conversation, and as we engage in that, we're more powerful and stronger together. So please take a break, stretch, fill up your coffee, and we will be back in about 15 minutes, right at 11:30, to be joined by the Honorable Maryam Monsef and a panel of truly inspiring leaders. Welcome back, everyone. I'm so excited to have you here. For those of you who are just tuning in to our broadcast today, my name is Julia Anderson, and I am the CEO of the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, one of the hosts of today's events. I'm so excited that you're joining us to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the report on the Royal Commission of the Status of Women on this day. As I noted earlier, I've been thinking a lot about home. It's the holiday season and we are not traveling. And so I wanted to pay special acknowledgement to the place that I was raised, where there were many diverse First Nations and Métis people whose ancestors have walked the land since time immemorial. I have been profoundly impacted by their care of the land and by the lessons that they've passed on to me. And it was a great privilege to have lived and learned and been raised on the traditional territory of Treaty 8. And we now have participants joining us from all across this Turtle Island, from coast to coast to coast. And I hope that all of our words today do honor, give honor, and do justice to the many First Nations and the many lessons that come to us from the First People of Canada. In the last hour, we heard from these 12 great Canadian icons who have each worked to overcome roadblocks. They saw a future beyond the horizon, a future that was different from the reality that they lived in. And then they worked day in and day out to make that future a reality. We are thankful for them, for their past leadership and for their continued leadership and the impact that it's having on our Canadian society. It is now my pleasure to hand the broadcast over to our next inspiring group of women, led by the Honorable Miriam Monsef, Minister for Women and Gender Equality and Rural Economic Development. Minister Monsef is going to be joined by 5 young panelists who are each making important contributions today, but also will carry the torch forward, as the saying goes, into our next 50 years of change. I'm going to introduce them quickly to you, and then I'm going to pass it on. I have to say, we've had a couple prep sessions and about 15 minutes before this session, and I already have goosebumps. I'm so excited to hear what they have to say about what is still left to be done and about all the history that needs to be made over the next 50 years. So let me first introduce Ayishta Agarwal. She's a second-year medical student at Queen's University. She's also the founder of Mom's the Word, a sexual and maternal health community organization that has provided support to thousands of marginalized girls and women. Ayishta has received wide acclaim for her work, including being named the top 30 under 30 for sustainable leaders and a top 25 women of influence, among others. Erica Dupuis, I welcome you. She is a practicing registered social worker in the Greater Toronto Area and a county coordinator of the Canadian chapter of International Alliance for Family Planning, which is an NGO that works to expand and support adolescent and youth sexual health education across the globe. She is also the vice chair of the Toronto Youth Food Policy Council and sits on the board of directors for Charlie's Freewheels and Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. I welcome you. I also welcome Nikki Fraser, who is an Indigenous advocate from Kamloops, British Columbia, and a student at Thompson Rivers University. She started Uniting Our Voices, a platform working towards inclusion and equality by creating space for more Indigenous voices to be heard, to build connections, to work in partnership, and to inspire more change makers through stories and engagement. Nikki is part of the United Nations Young Leaders for the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and for the United Nations Youth Envoy, and was named one of Flair's magazine 50 Top Women, How I Made It in 2019-2020. Faye Johnstone is a principal consultant with Wisdom to Action. I welcome you here today, Faye, based on Algonquin territory in Ottawa. She has led local, provincial, and national initiatives focused on 2 SLGBTQ+ communities, mental health, gender-based violence, and a host of other important issues. And she was the 2019 recipient of the LGBT Youth Line Trans Activism Award. They also serves on the board of directors of Kind Space and the Ontario Youth Suicide Prevention Leadership Committee. And last, but certainly not least, Mukisa Kabambe is a student at Dalhousie's School of Law, interested in advancing the protection of human rights and access to justice. As a member of the board of directors and co-chair of the first Black Youth Advocacy Council and Delorme's Buddy Day Learning Institute, she supports their work in identifying systemic barriers, talking about intersectionality, specifically facing young African Nova Scotian learners. It is my great pleasure to welcome you and to introduce the Honorable Mariam Monsef, who is going to be asking you a host of questions. I'm very excited to hear about what the report was missing and what the report needs, how we need to live out a future that identifies, that lives in the space of those gaps. I think we heard our speakers earlier talking a little bit about that. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Minister Monsef, and I'm going to be quiet and learn and listen. Thank you, Minister Monsef.
Thank you so much, Julia Anderson. I think we can all agree that you having a voice and you speaking up and doing what you do is good for all of us here in Canada, and your impact is having ripple effects all over the world. Many thanks to you and to the wonderful team at CanWaCH for joining up with us to make sure that this important day, this really important day for all of us, including the women of Canada, is commemorated. And we share the stories that don't often get told, and we shine light on the incredible leaders in our communities who are continuing the work of those who have come before us. Bonjour, Anin. Salam alaikum. I join you from Algonquin territory, just a few feet away from the House of Commons, where that historic and groundbreaking report was tabled 50 years ago today. When it was tabled, there was one woman in the House of Commons, 6 women in the Senate. There was no shelter movement. There was no Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It would take another 25 years before women's rights, our human rights, would be famously quoted. It would be a couple of decades before the nation would have a consciousness-raising experience around violence against women. And of course, it would be decades, 45 years to be exact, before there would be a gender balance cabinet. It would be close to 50 years before there'd be an intersectional gendered lens applied to every federal budget. So needless to say, that report has made a big impact in all of our lives. So let's begin with gratitude. Let's begin with thank yous for those who had the audacity to dream it up in the first place. For those who persisted, the report wasn't a given, as none of our progress is. People who are pushing for it got a no the first time, got a no the second time, and it was only on their third try when the sole woman in the cabinet, the Honorable Judy LaMarche, was able to align well with the grassroots movement to get a yes. And the yes came in at the time when Laura Sabia, the head of Canadian University Women, threatened to bring 2 million women marching to Parliament Hill. None of our progress has happened on its own. None of our progress has occurred without hard work. None of it is guaranteed. And when we lose sight of all that we have in common, we lose gains. When we are focused on what divides us as opposed to what unites us, we lose gains. And when we take for granted the progress made, we lose ground. So let us thank the first woman to chair a Royal Commission, the amazing Florence Bird. Let us thank the 4 women who joined her and the 2 men who were part of this work, the Public Service of Canada for doing something that had never been done before, and everybody from media to the courage of those who gave testimony to make sure that the report reflected the realities of Canadians. We wouldn't be here in this way without them and without that report 50 years ago. So now we have an obligation. We have an obligation to those who have come before us and those who will come after us to protect the progress made, to protect these hard-won gains. There's always been backlash to progress. and that backlash requires us to stay united as a movement. There has, of course, been inconsistency and slow progress, but we are making that progress. And now COVID, this disease that is so cruel, that has taken away our abilities to stay connected at a time when we need our communities and our loved ones the most. We are forced to separate out of love and care for them. It's also shone light on the cracks in our systems, and it has undoubtedly hit women hardest, with work hours lost, wages lost, increases in paid work, that is care work, increases in unpaid care work, and of course, increases in severity and prevalence of gender-based violence. We will not lose the hard-won gains that those before us fought so hard for. We will protect that progress. We will remain on the unfinished business that remains. There may be a gender balanced cabinet. There may be 100 women in the House of Commons for the first time ever. There may be parity in the Senate. Today, 47 women and 47 men. But are women in positions of leadership always safe, always respected? The gender wage gap may have come a long way. It was 60 cents when the report was tabled. It's at 87 cents now. But we've yet to close the gender wage gap. There may be more women in positions of power and leadership than ever before, but less than 5% of Canada's CEOs are women. And those who are in those seats earn 68 cents on the dollar of their male counterparts' earnings. Of the 167 recommendations in that report, everything from childcare to supporting the women's movement to appointing a minister responsible for the status of women. So many gains have been responded to, but the report was silenced on the issue of violence against women, on the issue of gender-based violence. 1 in 3 women experiences it. Every 6th day, a woman dies in the hands of her partners. The tragedy of missing and Indigenous women and girls and LGBTQ2 folks remains. And so we have much work to do, but there is hope. On December 6th, last night, for the first time since the horrible tragedy of the Montreal massacre, we couldn't come together as a nation. But you know what happened just days before? In the House of Commons, every leader of every political party stood and used words like misogyny, feminism, gender equality, and renewed their resolve to do better and to be better for the women and girls of this country. That's progress. That didn't happen on its own. We're having conversations about she-covery. We are applying an intersectional gendered lens to the COVID response. The Prime Minister of Canada has committed to establishing a task force to ensure that women's economic gains are at the heart of Canada's recovery from the pandemic. Just days ago, a woman stood in the House of Commons and tabled the Fall Economic Statement, the first time there's been a woman finance minister in this country. Universal early learning and childcare is happening. We are moving forward, and there has never been more of us at the table, and there has never been more at stake. From here on, it's up to us to protect that progress and to ensure that the unfinished business is what we focus on, and to ensure that we remain united in our efforts to completing that unfinished business. And to have young leaders like Mukisa, like Nikki, like Erica, like Ishita, like Faye, reminding us of how powerful this movement is exactly the great big dose of hope that I need today, and I know that we can all benefit from today. So let's hear from them. Colleagues, first of all, thank you for your contributions to the movement, for the hard work that you do. I hope you're safe, I hope you're well, and I wish the same for your loved ones. Nikki, Ishita, and Faye, the first question is for you. Women in the economy, women in the family, unpaid care work, the participation of women in public life were central chapters within the report. I would love to hear your thoughts on what some ways that we've progressed are, where do we stand today, and what should our priorities be for the next 50 years? And we will begin with you, Nikki.
So, Waikukaitip, everybody who's joining us today across Turtle Island. Nikki Fraser Squest to Kamloops Sahwin. I am Nikki and I am from Kamloops. And thank you, Minister, for your opening remarks. I think that was a beautiful way to start off this conversation about looking at the next 5 decades, especially starting off on gratitude. I think far too often we look at a lens critically and forget to acknowledge what has been done and what is continuing to be done at the ground level and the grassroots level. So Kukshachim for centering us in a good place and starting us in a good way. Kind of reminds me of when we meet as Indigenous in groups, we start off in prayer to remind us of our gratitude. So that kind of was like a prayer opening for me. So it was beautiful words. And looking at the report as a mother, the last 50 years, if I was a mom back then, I'm a mother of 2. I think it would look way different for me than if I was a mom 50 years ago. And I feel like we have made some progress, especially collectively, but the blanket approach doesn't really help a lot of women today. Coming from a background as an Indigenous woman on reserve, it looks quite different when there's intersectionalities. So I acknowledge that the work that has been done has been amazing, and I'm a benefiter of that work, and my children are a benefiter of that work. So yeah, and thank you, Kshachim.
Thank you, Nikki. CanWaCH, merci for your thoughtful contributions and for getting us started. Ishita, over to you.
Thank you, Minister. And thank you for the opportunity to speak today. So I completely agree with everything that Nikki said. I think that it's important to remember how far we've come, because I do think that a lot of progress has been made in the past 50 years that I don't think would have been possible if it wasn't for this report. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that. I know that since the report came out, there's been more entry of married women into the labor force. There's been more female representation on leadership boards and on government councils and advisory committees. And as you mentioned, Minister, the pay gap is nowhere near as large as it was previously. So there's definitely been quite a bit that we have to celebrate. That being said, I do think that moving forward, there is a lot of room for growth as a peoples and as a nation. I think that originally for me, a lot of the focus of the original report was on eliminating overt discriminatory actions against women and female identifying groups. And I think we've now reached a point in our society where we are more likely to frown on obvious acts of discrimination. But I think in practice, systemic barriers still exist in each of these areas that we've been discussing that continue to marginalize women and female identifying groups in subtler ways. So moving forward, I'd love to have more of a conversation about not treating women as one homogenous group, really recognizing that it's composed of diverse subgroups, each of which have their own unique needs and challenges, and then really working with those specific subgroups to address things that are important to them.
Thank you so much, Ashita. Yes, it's hard to believe that 50 years ago, pregnancy was a grounds for being dismissed from your job. There are no women in too many critical roles, and that being a woman, the sex typing of jobs was just the way that things were. Absolutely, we have to build on that progress. And Faye, would love to hear your thoughts.
First off, I want to echo what Nikki and Ishita said, both in terms of like thanking you for hosting today, Minister, and also to CanWaCH for bringing everybody together. But also in terms of appreciating how far we have come over the past 50 years. But at the same time, I struggle with my desire to like celebrate the progress, while of course acknowledging that if this report was published today, a lot of the folks on this call would probably say, "Oh God, this is not adequate." That it doesn't reflect it doesn't reflect adequately the experiences of women who aren't white, who aren't straight, who aren't cis, who aren't probably like wealthy to some extent. And I think that is important to highlight. I also think it's important to honor the work that those women who wrote this report have done. In trans communities, we talk a lot about how disconnected we are from our elders. There are very clear reasons for that. The reasons for that are that many of them aren't alive anymore. And that many of them have not had the opportunity to see their lives radically changed by this report. And so I want to praise this report, but then I reflect on the fact that 84% of trans folks still avoid public spaces. And so when we talk about existence in public life, it's hard to think about that without reflecting on my own experiences and those of my peers who are still harassed in public like all too often, who are still afraid to walk down streets at night. And frankly, like during the day most of the time, to think about how trans folks, 48% of trans folks in Canada make under $30,000 a year. And so I think I want to like both praise this report, but also acknowledge that I think it couldn't remotely capture what we need today. And to hope that moving forward, we can do this with a commitment, not only to like an intersectional approach, because I think that is crucial, but to actioning that approach with the appropriate resources and funding. Because I think we get caught up in the symbolism of having more folks and more women in power, and that's great. But none of those women are trans women. None of those folks are folks that I particularly relate to in a lot of ways. So I think it's great. We've done some good work, but in my books, the amount that's left to do is more than what we've done. And I think that is probably my main sticking point today.
That's an excellent sticking point and one to remain focused on with determination and with the same persistence that has brought us to this moment in time. Our work is far from over. The unfinished business is, from what I hear, across the country, this is exhausting work. And it is hard to explain what the most exhausting part of it is, the emotional labor or the consistent going against the current. But when we stick together, when we remain connected, that's when we build on that progress. And to have voices like yours, I think that's a big part of the work and the struggle ahead. So let's talk about what would we do differently? I would love to hear from Erica, from Faye, from Mokiza, and from Nikki. Comment on the issues, themes, or people you feel were not included or adequately addressed within the report. I think Faye's just done an excellent job at giving us just a glimpse, but how can we do better at applying a more intersectional feminist lens going forward? Recognizing that, of course, there's no substitute to being at the table. So, Erica, can we start with you?
Sure thing. Thank you so much again, Minister, and to CanWaCH and to Nikki, Faye, and Ashita's comments earlier. I think I'll be talking a lot about some very similar themes as well. In the short amount of time that I have to speak today, I won't be able to identify all of the gaps or all of the folks who are missing, but I will just talk about some pressing realizations and reflections that I had. So, you know, in its entirety in the report, it often describes gender in binary, right? Making explicit reference to male and female, men and women, so on and so forth, which of course leaves no room for discussion or nuances of two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming identities. And as well, no room to discuss nuance within said identities. So, you know, I think we were talking about the wage gap before, right? It's not enough to simply state that, you know, wages should be equal for men and women when Black, Indigenous, and racialized identities continue to this day to not receive equitable pay. As well, I think most notably, the voices of Black, Indigenous, and racialized identities are omitted from this report. Even through reading it again, I can, you know, start to imagine the possibilities of what this report could look like, what could be improved upon if there was not just equitable consultation, moving away from consultation and actual action as well. I'm thinking those with lived experiences of navigating institutional barriers and education, immigration, housing, employment, so on and so forth. And I'm really mindful of this and cautious of this idea of representation that's referenced so much throughout the report, whether that be, you know, more women should be brought onto boards or commissions or task force. We need to be explicit when discussing our gender equity efforts. Yes, we should be demanding that more women are brought to the table, but I think we should be demanding that Black, Indigenous, and women and identities are prioritized in these discussions and efforts. And lastly, I'll try to wrap it up quickly, but how we can do better in applying a more intersectional lens, I think we got to really unpack what intersectionality means, right? And I know the folks here will understand, but for folks at home, intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It's rooted in Black feminist struggle and as an analysis of violence against racialized women. So in that sense, we require power sharing. We require meaningful redistribution of resources. Intersectionality is about individual identities, but it's also more so about how different systems of oppressions work together to produce conditions of inequity. So we need to emphasize on, you know, representation and sharing of power, but ultimately, you know, we really need to work towards dismantling our structures of oppression rather than focusing and emphasizing about representation within it. So it requires a greater systemic overhaul more than anything.
Brilliant. Thank you, Erica. And of course, the question that follows is, how do we best use the progress made to beget further progress? Thank you so much for that. Faye, can I come back to you?
Yeah, for sure. I think, as Erica said, I think intersectionality is something that I hate that it's almost becoming a buzzword because that was never the intent. And I think we throw it into things like everyone's an intersectional feminist, but I don't think many of us reflect on what that means. What does it mean as individuals? Like I'm approaching this space as a white person, I'm middle class, I'm a settler on this land. I think when we use intersectionality, we sometimes use it to like dodge accountability for our own relationship to power and privilege. We use it to you know, slap on this idea of diversity without reflecting on how we take up space. Even in spaces like this, right? Like I think I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be, you know, speaking to some degree as a trans person on violence against women and gender-based violence in general. But I think intersectionality also requires that we reflect on ourselves and what we can do to, you know, uplift voices that aren't present at the table. But more than that, how we can, in the spaces that we are allowed access to, how we can push people to do things differently. And I think we almost have a responsibility to be troublemakers with that in mind. To say that, like, as folks who are able to say that, who are less likely to face repercussions for calling things out, we have an obligation to do that work and do it loudly and do it with connection to the communities that who we don't share identity with more than anything else. In terms of what I hope, you know, comes from this, or what themes I hope can carry forward, I think again the public life piece is important. I always get troubled with conversation on representation, I think similarly to Erica, because trans women and trans women folks have had representation. That's part of why we are always harassed. And so representation and visibility is powerful, and it can be meaningful. It's also violent. It's also murderous. It also results in so many trans folks not living to be adults, not living to meet the, you know, average life expectancy. And so I think I love, you know, engagement in public life, but public life for a lot of people has more risks than I think we've begun to really process. And I think that makes it tricky, because if we had a trans woman in cabinet, that would be great. she would also be harassed, probably to a degree that all of us would be terrified of. When trans folks speak out in public life in Canada, we get hate mail, and like a lot of it. There are organized groups that are resisting trans voices and trans equality, and they're continuing to succeed in some terrifying ways. And so I think I'll leave it on this idea that I want us to, when we think about responding to systemic oppression, I want us to both look at the broad. How do we create systems and supports that reflect the needs of all communities? But then how do we also invest targeted funds to support underrepresented or particularly impacted groups? And so we need, shelters for everybody, but we also need shelters that are safe for trans people. We also need shelters that are going to guarantee safety for the 20 to 40% of homeless young folks in Canada who identify as 2S LGBTQ+. So we need both broad support and inclusive services, but we also need targeted interventions because we know that certain communities have particular needs that can't actually be adequately met without targeted interventions. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I love what you said about troublemakers. I think that there's a way to disagree without being disagreeable, as somebody pretty amazing once famously said. And there's a need to continue the struggle and to continue to ask the questions, and most importantly, to continue to show that a better way is possible. And Faye, you're absolutely right with the costs of representation. It's something to think about as more and more across the country are speaking out about all the ways that risks have amplified as more women and diverse leaders take positions of power, is this: if the most powerful women, and I will use women in the very deliberate sense of the word right now, if the most powerful women experience that level of hate, that level of disrespect, and that level of violence, then how vulnerable and how hard it must be for those with far less power. And that's our responsibility, right? That's our commitment. So let's hear from somebody whom we've not heard from. Mukiza, let's hear your thoughts.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mukiza Kembo. I'm speaking to you from Halifax, Nova Scotia, also known as Mi'kma'ki. I'm a law student. I am part of the Indigenous Black and Mi'kmaq program at Dalhousie University's Schulich School of Law, and that's where I'm speaking from today. And I'm so grateful for my co-panelists who have done such a great job at bringing this conversation into a space where it is so much more progressive and representative than we are used to seeing. So thank you for that. And thank you, Erica, for that definition of intersectionality. I think that's really important. So for me, what was missing from the report was any sort of substantial discussion of race at all. So just like Ishita mentioned, the report refers to women as like a homogeneous group. And as an example, the report mentions that women gained the federal right to vote in 1918. But what it fails to mention is that not all women gained that right to vote. Black and Indigenous women did not gain the right to vote in 1918. We didn't gain that right until 1922. So just generally, the failure to recognize racial or other differences leaves a lot of women behind and leaves us with less support to fight for our rights. So yeah, I think that that's an important piece right there, because we have to acknowledge that among women, we have different levels of privilege and we have different access to resources. So in coming up with solutions, when we don't acknowledge that, we fail to create solutions for Black women. We fail to create solutions for trans women, for women with disabilities, and all the other intersectional identities that come with that. So moving on to the question of how we can improve our application of intersectionality, I think that for me, the question needs to be addressed from both a political perspective and a personal perspective. So starting with the political perspective, I think we need people who have that specific knowledge and skill set to translate intersectional theory, or that theoretical lens, to an actual practice and policy and law. I guess like bring it back to like an everyday example. Generally, I think people can acknowledge that for me as a Black woman pursuing a career in the field of law, that I'm going to face more barriers than would a cis white man with the same qualifications as myself. So from a legal and policy perspective, we need to understand how to practically address those issues beyond just acknowledging that that is a fact in itself. So I think that given the complexity of intersectional theory, that it'd be best to find experts in that field and add them to review processes in the law, review processes in policy, and in the creation of those structures, so that it's mandatory for intersectional experts to weigh in and propose edits to any of those policies and laws. So I think on a personal level, we need to find a way to be able to discuss these power imbalances from a place of compassion rather than from a place of defensiveness. So I think that oftentimes when people hear the word privilege, they feel like it's an attack on themselves. They've worked hard, they feel like it's an attack on their accomplishments. And then once people are in that defensive mode, then they're not actually listening or understanding where that perspective is coming from. So they can't understand the true meaning of privilege, which is basically recognizing that you might have access to more opportunities. You might have access to better opportunities because of your race, for example, or because of your gender. So I think just to summarize, like privilege isn't anybody's individual fault, but it is everybody's responsibility to recognize it and use that knowledge to push for equality. So I guess to sum up in conclusion, like to better apply intersectionality, people have to become familiar with that uncomfortable feeling and work through it.
Thanks so much, Mukisa. The brilliance that you've just shared and the experts on the panel have just shared. We've all just had a chance to hear from you all, and you know, as the Prime Minister says, young people aren't the leaders of tomorrow, they're leading today. And we all do better by listening and learning and creating platforms for opportunities like this. Prime Minister sat next to Anita Anand, a racialized woman herself, along with Patty Hyde, leading the vaccine and the COVID response. Though times have changed, there's most certainly room for the expertise that Mukisa shared. And I'm excited about what's going to happen to the field of law because of leaders like you going into it. Okay, so Nikki, let's go back to you. Your thoughts and reflections.
First of all, I want to echo what everyone has said before, especially when it came to recognizing. I acknowledge and appreciate that each and every one of you acknowledged the lack of representation when it came to Indigenous voices altogether, but in particular, the lack of representation when it came to Indigenous women's voices. I did read the report and it was mentioned, but I feel like there was not proper representation of Indigenous women. And we look at Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and they're so diverse, and they have different unique needs, as Aisha mentioned in her answering the question, is looking at it in diverse subgroups because of those diverse needs. And I thought that was really important to touch on, because that's something that I always bring when I sit at tables or in conversations like this, often being the only Indigenous voice at the table. I often say, I don't represent all Indigenous voices, and I would never want to take those Indigenous, their voices away from them. Instead, I want to make room for them at the table. There should be more room for them at the table. And watching the video that we, prior to this panel discussion, there was a video, and it was a legacy of the last 50 years, and there was incredible women on there that have paved the way for us to sit here and have these conversations today. But two Indigenous women were on there, and they did mention the fact that the lack of the Indigenous women's voice. They acknowledged that Marion Bowler acknowledged that it was a blueprint, that this commission was a blueprint for paving the way. And also Roberta mentioned that there's lots of heavy lifting to be done. And Minister Monsef mentioned that hard work can be exhausting. And I think moving forward, the hard work shouldn't just be put on women. It shouldn't just be it should be spread out equally, and to achieve all these goals and all these things that we want to achieve. We're going to need our counterparts, our opposites, to help us with that. And so I definitely feel like it's that's something that we need to work with all together. Coming from the Sustainable Development Goals perspective, you can't achieve one goal without working on another. And I feel like that's the same thing here, the interconnectedness. As I believe that as Indigenous people, that's something we really believe in as well, as the interconnectedness. So to achieve these goals, we have to definitely work together. So that includes having representation all across and diverse voices all across the table, and a part of the plan for the next 5 decades.
Thank you so much, Nikki, and for quoting Ishida's wisdom in your response. One of the things that I've learned from elders in my own community is always ask who's not in the room, and just notice it, right? And often the voices not at the table reflect some of those that you shared, those with disabilities, those who have language barriers, those who weren't able to get childcare to show up to this thing, those who didn't have transportation to get into the room, those who may not know how to be at the table and how to be effective, and at the same time, people who absolutely belong at the table. You talked about interconnectedness, and I think that's a lovely way to go into closing thoughts for today. This virus, the pandemic, has reminded us of just how vital our connections are. The report on its own is a giant book that I'm so thrilled to hear you actually read. I'm turning it into one of those coffee table books, because it's some of the progress that we've made, some of the things that were the norm 50 years ago are actually laughable, and some continue to persist in their harm, and there needs to be more work. But you talk about connections. The report itself is just a lot of paper, about 488 pages. It was the conversations and the community engagements in the course of the 3 years that the report ran. It was the media coverage and the Doris Andersons of Canada shining light on it with the media platforms that they had. And then it was the conversations that took place following a report. There was a conference hosted in Vancouver, and then shortly after, something in Toronto, and it maintained the momentum. And then before you knew it, there was as Lynn Zimmer in Peterborough called it, a spontaneous combustion, kind of a wildfire across the country. Those connections are what enabled that momentum to continue. And those connections during COVID especially have become that much more precious, that much more important. Indeed, the strength of our response so far in COVID has been the strength of our connections. So as we connect with you brilliant leaders whom we may not have had a chance to connect with had COVID not required this virtual gathering, let's turn it over to you for your closing remarks. And this is your space to use up as you will. We'll begin with Faye. We'll hear from Ishida, Erica, Mukisa, and Nikki. Are you okay with wrapping it up? Okay, let's go.
So I think for me, I want to, similarly to how we spoke about the report, I want to acknowledge the last 5 years in particular. I think we've seen some really phenomenal progress over the past 5 years that I would candidly say might not have happened under the previous government. But I also want to, similarly to the report, acknowledge that while that is phenomenal work, there is still so much more to do. And I think while we are lucky to have a government that calls itself feminist and that strives to hold itself up to that standard and that ideal, I think it's our responsibility to say that they're not doing it well enough and they're not doing enough. And to do that consistently, no matter how well they perform, no matter how much we do, I think it is our obligation to actually criticize and to criticize with love as much as we can, but criticize and expect better. I think that we need to set a higher standard. I think it is our responsibility to say, no, actually, like this is some good progress, but we've also been used to begging for scraps, and we always have. And so I think that in light of that, we need to challenge ourselves, our organizations, our communities, to say that we don't want scraps anymore, and to actually articulate what is needed, what funding, what resources, what policies are necessary so that we deliver on the world that we want for our communities. I want a world where trans folks can be out in public without being harassed. We haven't had that happen yet. I don't believe that there are enough resources dedicated to LGBTQ inclusion in this country from any level of government to deliver on genuine liberation for trans communities or any of our communities. And so I think my one message is let's expect and demand better because we deserve better. Thank you so much.
Hear, hear. Faye, you're brilliant and so right. Up until last year, the federal government had not put out a funding envelope specifically for LGBTQ2+ folks. It's the first time ever. And so absolutely, we have a long way to go. And thank you for sharing your vision, a world where trans folks, LGBTQ2 folks are not harassed. And that isn't asking for much. Thank you for that. Okay, who would like to go next?
I think I was next, so I'll take it away. I'm just gonna echo some of what Faye said. I think that we've made considerable strides over the last 50 years, and that's fantastic. We should acknowledge and congratulate ourselves for that. But I do think that moving forward, women and female identifying groups remain one of the most undervalued assets that Canada has. And it's been shown, research has shown time and time again that when women thrive, families thrive, communities thrive, economies thrive. So gender equality really is beneficial for everyone. And it should be something that everyone has a stake in and everyone has an interest in. If I could just make one ask for whoever might be listening and has any power in that regard. I'd love to see more support for grassroots organizations and programming. I think that it's not that a lot of great work isn't already being done. Canada has amazing leaders that are already doing a lot in local communities. And oftentimes these organizations are being led by rights holders, which means they're being led by people who come from the communities that they're trying to serve. So not only do they know what needs to happen in order to make long-lasting change, they also have a vested interest in seeing those needs being met. And they're also in a very unique position to build trust with those communities and to build trust with the future generations of those communities. But despite that, they really don't get their due recognition. They don't get enough funding to carry out the work. And while I agree with Nikki that all of the hard work shouldn't fall on them, the reality is that many of it does, and some of the best work is produced through these organizations. So it's really important, I think, moving forward that we support their voices and in any way possible. So I'd love to see that rectified. And thank you all so much for this opportunity once again. It was a pleasure, Minister.
Sheeta, thank you so much. You're absolutely right. All the research points to, when women thrive, families thrive, and economies grow. In Canada, it's about $150 billion that we stand to gain when there is equal participation. And you're also right about the research that says the best way, the most effective way to advance equality, to advance women's rights is by investing in grassroots. And there's a balance between nothing for us without us and ensuring that men and those who have power and privilege and who want to be part of the work, that there's room for all. I will say my number one priority as the Minister for Women over the past 4 years has been strengthening the sustainability of the movement. And We have increased fivefold funding to frontlines, and we have seen the direct result of that investment, particularly during COVID. These organizations, as hard as it has been for them, they were able to build some resilience. And not only were they able to serve those in their communities, but their insights have shaped the government of Canada's response to COVID. And that support and that wisdom is invaluable. Thank you so much, Ishita. Erica, Mukisa, who'd like to go next?
I'll jump in real quick, just provide my thoughts and pass it over. But what I'm thinking is that, you know, any recommendations that come out of this, any progress, needs to be developed out of communal discussion, not necessarily consultation, but collective discussion, to be community-led and community identified, because advocacy in any capacity cannot occur in silos. It cannot be an individual approach. So in order for young people to create and develop strategies and move away from gender equality, but more so gender justice, it must be developed in community with the folks who are already doing this on the ground, with Black, Indigenous, and racialized women at the forefront, in order for our progress to be meaningful, equitable, and ultimately sustainable. So really, in conclusion, my recommendation is honestly listen to the folks on this call who have already provided their thoughts and their extraordinary insight and their recommendations, right? So I leave it with listen to young people and listen to women.
Beautiful. Well, as you say this, I've got running in my head a scheme on how to further connect the brilliant folks on this line to the work that we're doing to do just that, the communal discussions that you're talking about, to ensure buy-in at the community level, to ensure coordination and consistency and coherence across the country. I would say be careful what you wish for, because I realize if you're on this call, you are incredibly busy. You are an overachiever. You've got many responsibilities, whether they're care or professional or otherwise. You got a lot on your plate. But I'm so grateful to hear the energy and the commitment on this call, and you can be sure that we will put you to further work. The moment ahead and the moment right now, it's critical. There's never been more at stake, and we're counting on you to re-energize the movement. So Mukisa, share some of your energy and some of your reflections with us, please.
Thank you, Minister. Happy to. I definitely want to echo what Erica and Ishita mentioned about community-based knowledge, community-based organization. So I think I'm gonna flip it over to the systemic change that I would like to see. I think that right now the current systems that we have are not culturally responsive, and they're unfortunately not healing. And I want to bring attention to the criminal justice system and the child welfare system specifically. And I know that there has been a lot of talk of reforms, but I would really like to push to see a system that is actually rehabilitative. I think Canada has often focused on a system of punishment and focused so much on separating those that are criminalized from the public, but we fail to really acknowledge the growing number of women in prisons and the fact that women are the number one biggest population entering prisons right now. And they often, as the report actually mentions, the report talks about women in the criminal justice system and how they continually are released from prison and then brought back in. So that basically our systems right now are not working. We need systems that actually respond to our needs and responds to the needs of single parents, responds to the needs of people who are facing homelessness and addictions issues, so that they can get the help and the support and the resources they need, rather than being criminalized and having to pay more into this criminal justice system and having even less opportunities coming out of it. So that is what I wanted to share. I would say my call to action for the everyday person is just to work on understanding your social location as an individual to understand your access to power, and when you have the opportunity to speak up and advocate for other people, no matter what setting it is, to do that, because it makes all of the difference in the world. And yeah, I think that's it for me. It has been such an honor to be on this call. Thank you so much, Minister, for having me.
The honor is all mine, and as promised, my team is already having chats I can see about ways to further benefit from all your wisdom. Thank you, and for also reminding us that it's individuals absolutely play a really powerful role, but at the same time, there are systems and practices and processes that still need to be improved, and I really appreciate the focus on women in incarcerated women, children in care, and all the ways that our criminal justice system, and I'd say our family justice system, still need to progress. And as I listen to you, Mukisa, Carolyn Bennett, our Minister for Crown Indigenous Relations, would be very proud to hear you speak as you do, as she's a very big advocate for all of this. Thank you so much. Okay, Nikki, it's over to you.
So thank you, Minister, for hosting this important discussion. And thank you to all my co-panelists I've learned so much. I definitely want to echo the aspect of supporting grassroots organization. I think far too often, one of my young leaders, colleagues, he said, we don't have to wait for the government to lead us. We could do that ourselves. And so he started a program in India called Feeding India, where he collects food from restaurants that would be thrown away, and long story short, gives it to people who live in poverty. And that was his way of not leading initiative without not waiting for everyone else to do it. He just took lead in doing that. And I think that's something that a lot of grassroots movements and organizations are doing, that they are already doing the work. They just need us to go stand beside them, to uplift the work that they already have been doing. And I love that Aisha said that in her call to action to everybody who's watching this. I feel like there's so many different grassroots movements that are out there that are already, that have the voice, that have voices that have lived experiences. So I think that's really important. I also like the fact that the criminal justice system was mentioned. I feel like there's a huge overrepresentation in all areas of the Commission report of Indigenous women, especially in the criminal justice system. Overrepresentation of Indigenous women there, especially with the social child welfare system too, overrepresentation of Indigenous women being represented in there. And I feel like that's where definitely we need some more work and support in those areas. And I do plan on going to law too because of that overrepresentation. So once I'm done my undergrad, I'll be going to law school, and they just opened a law school here at TRU. So that's where I do plan on going because of that overrepresentation of Indigenous women in poverty, Indigenous women in the criminal justice system, Indigenous women in the child welfare system. And so yes, I definitely would like, if my call to action would be to follow the echo of supporting grassroots movements that are already doing the work. Instead of reinventing the wheel, there's already voices out there that are doing the great work that is already needed to be done. They just need our support on uplifting their platform. And I feel like today's social media world, and a lot of us out there have a huge following. Young people have a huge following on social media. And we've seen a great example of that when we seen Blackout Friday, or were muted, where social media influencers muted themselves and gave their platforms to people of color, Black business owners. And I feel like that's something we could do if we have that following, to uplift those voices, those organizations in our social media following. And it cost us nothing. It literally just cost us a few seconds to tag their handle, to support their work. And we do see a lot of social media influencers doing that today. So I want to say thank you for those that are doing that. And I hope that our young people continue to do that and use that social media platform to uplift those voices. So Kukshachim, everybody, for tuning in and listening to this conversation. Kukshachim to the minister and to CanWaCH for hosting us today. And I'm looking forward to working with everybody here for the next 5 decades. And maybe in 5 decades, my daughter will sit on the youth panel and give us a report card on how we've done. And so Kukshachim, thank you.
Kukshachim and inshallah. As you said, Nikki, individual actions matter. Our actions matter. Lifting up others matters. The most important thing that we can do as feminists and equity seekers is to be kind to one another. The work is hard. The work is exhausting. There aren't too many moments of celebration and victory. And so to the extent that you can, and look for those opportunities to be kind. And I think today is also a reminder to all of us politicians that these big reports that we work on, that our teams work on, they matter. They send shockwaves across the country and beyond our borders. And, you know, we will be remembered by future generations like your daughter, Nikki. We will be remembered by what we did with these reports, but also how we pen these reports. And as you all reminded us, particularly Mukisa and Ishita, that systems can change. Systems do change slowly, but not necessarily naturally. It is a deliberate, coordinated, relentless attempt that leads to systemic change. And I am hopeful because you exist. I am hopeful because your voices matter and that you're using the gifts that have been given to you so wisely in the service of others, in the betterment of communities, and that you are the most powerful generation to have ever lived. And this is what you're choosing to devote your time and talent to. I'm also hopeful because the smallest of changes in the pursuit of this work actually lead to tectonic shifts, even the smallest. So let's remember to savor the small steps forward, the gains made. Let's remember that none of it can be taken for granted, that complacency is not an option, and that in fact, despite all the ways that life is hard, there has never been a better time to be a woman in Canada, and we owe it to those who've come before us to make it even better and even easier for those who are going to come after. Many thanks to our colleagues at CanWaCH, to those who've had the courage to speak up before the rest of us found our voice, and I really do hope that you all take good care. Your country needs you, and this wonderful movement we all belong to most definitely needs you. Take good care. CanWaCH. Merci. Bye for now.